It's so great to see all of you joining us from all over the world. Welcome and buenos dias, buongiorno, ni hao, guten tag, assalamu alaikum, gudag, and a few other languages out there. We're so excited today to share language equity, redefining our language learning practices to empower multilinguals. We've had 900 people register for this webinar today from 67 countries. And we are just so thrilled to see the interest in this very important topic. Today is International Mother Languages Day, and we are not only here to celebrate the many diverse languages in our community, but we are thinking about how to maximize our practices to empower multilinguals. My name is Trillium Hiblin. I am the Associate Director for School Accreditation and Improvement at NEASC, working with the International Schools arm of NEASC. So we are very pleased today to present to you Ceci Gomez-Galvez. Ceci uses the pronouns she, her, and ella. She is a collaborator, coach, and advocate who empowers educators to create equitable learning opportunities for all language learners. Born and raised in Guatemala City, Ceci grew up in a unique bilingual household nurtured by her parents who valued languages equally. Inspired by her own upbringing and her extensive experience in international schools, Ceci now leads a support program for multilingual learners based on practices which ensure culturally responsive teaching and equitable access. You can connect with Ceci through her professional portfolio and follow her on Twitter, and I'll put those two links into the chat for you in just a moment. So now I will hand it off to Ceci. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you, Trillium. Gracias. Well, good day, good evening to everybody. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas, bienvenides. As Trillium so kindly introduced, my name is Ceci, and I am so excited and so honored to be sharing space with the NEASC community. And speaking of language equity, which is one of my passions, not just as a BML or bilingual and multilingual learner, but also as the leader of a team who also supports multilingual learners in an international school. Let me share my screen so we can get started. And as Trillium said, this link will be available for you, the link to this slide deck, which has all of the resources that I will be sharing today linked within the slides. So all you need to have is the slide deck, and Trillium will also share a link to the Padlet, which we will use towards the end for our reflection, but also will give space for questions in case anything is lingering after this hour together where I'll be sharing with you about language equity practices. So I invite you, first of all, as part of this PLN, to just kind of go through some norms. It's important, all of us. I mean, I think there were about 900 people signed up for this session. So whether you are present right now live or you're watching this later, we need to continue to think about our positionality and what we bring to spaces in professional learning communities. So please, I invite you to come as you are. For some of you, it might be the morning. For some of you, middle of the day. For some of you, maybe late at night. I know that it's 9 p.m. for me here. I'm based in Saigon in Vietnam. So please come as you are. We're going to have time for reflection throughout this presentation. So if you need to take time to reflect on the content on your own, or if you're more of the person who likes to engage with us in the chat, please do come as you are. Be open to a spectrum of ideas, perspectives, and stories. We all come from different places, and part of the core of the message of this session really is that empathy that we have for each other and how we come together under the language equity umbrella to really be together as a community, as a global community. And also assume positive intentions while also recognizing your impact. You might be visiting us as an administrator, you might be visiting us, you might be joining the session as a teacher, as a multilingual learner, as a monolingual person. So just keep in mind your positionality and your impact when you are sharing on the chat, when you are reflecting with the professional learning community, both here or on the Padlet. So the norms are here. If you need to go back and review these norms at any point, they will be available for you on the slide deck. So to talk about language equity, first, we need to kind of unpack what language inequity means and what I will be bringing into the space to define the term of language inequity. And I mean, language inequity and language segregation has been biblical. It's been legendary. Of course, some of you might have heard about the Tower of Babel story, about when this deity, mankind built this huge structure to kind of reach this deity at the top. And then as a punishment for trying to become this for trying to reach this powerful deity, the deity just kind of like breaks this structure apart, and it separates people by language. So in the end, nobody can communicate with each other, and so it is impossible for people to come together and grow together or plan together to reach something higher. I mean, stories of how language transcends time and how it's tied to culture have been put on the screen as well. This is one of my favorite movies of all time, mainly because the superhero is like a language teacher and a linguist. But I love this story because it talks about how language brings us together. It does transcend time. The reason we exist today in our stories and what we've learned and what we know is because of the inheritance of language and stories from our ancestors. And so in the premise in the movie, language is centered as the most important part for a community, a global community, to come together for survival, for advancement, for growth. And so I really like it. I recommend it for anybody who would like to watch it. Because language inequity can either unite or divide us. But there is someone who always benefits from the segregation of language. And today we're going to hear from a story from someone who has lived this segregation of language in different ways. And then we're going to listen to her talk, to her TEDx talk, and then we are going to unpack that throughout the session and how it resonates with you in your current context, in your learning space, and also maybe how it resonates with you as a human being, perhaps you are a bilingual or multilingual person. So who benefits from the segregation of language? All right, let me double check that I'm sharing my sound. All right, here we go.
U.S. schools have come a long way since desegregation, but they still have a long way to go, especially as it relates to language equity and opportunities for students in public schools. It's estimated that by 2020, 1 out of every 4 students in U.S. schools will be Latino. And this presents an opportunity to build on the rich cultural heritage of these students and to build on their rich heritage language in order to make more equitable experiences, not only for them, but higher quality educational experiences for all students. I was born in El Paso, Texas, and grew up in Corpus Christi, Texas. And in this region, all of this territory was once Mexico. And people of Mexican heritage will proudly tell you that they did not cross the border crossed them. This land became part of the United States after the Mexican-American War. My grandma Simona was born in 1915, and she attended Mexican schools, and most of her life she spoke only Spanish. I was born in 1971 and went to school in South Texas, and most of my life I only spoke English. Following the end of slavery in Texas, Mexicans experienced much of the same discrimination as blacks under Jim Crow law. Same loss of liberty, same loss of life. In one of the biggest ranches in Texas, over 800,000 acres, it said that there's a mesquite tree for every Mexican that was lynched there. And my grandmother ends up attending a Mexican school until the 3rd grade, when then she's forced to help support her family and work. And these Mexican schools were notorious for providing an inferior education, oftentimes poor facilities, poorly resourced. But my grandmother really internalized that as somehow her own fault. She said to me when I was young, she said, "Es que era muy burra, mija, no podía aprender inglés." The reality was she was denied schooling because she didn't speak English. And this doesn't really come into question until 1947 with the case of Mendez versus Westminster. This is when they finally began thinking about the rights of Mexican students in schools. And in this case, the federal court ruled that the separation of Mexican students into remedial Mexican schools was both unlawful and unconstitutional. And this is a really important court case because it lays the groundwork for Brown versus the Board of Education. And in fact, the NAACP had joined this case represented by Thurgood Marshall. And he goes on, of course, to represent the NAACP again in Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregates all schools, right, in the United States. Despite, desegregation, my family really struggled in school. To understand that even after desegregation, Mexican students still suffered from language discrimination. Students were punished for speaking Spanish in school. Sometimes they were classified as learning disabled if they couldn't learn English. My own parents were spanked for speaking Spanish in school. And they were brilliant people, but school was not a very safe place. My mother almost dropped out of high school, and my father, even as an English learner, managed to graduate from high school, but didn't really see a future for himself in higher education. He decided instead to enlist in the Navy during the Vietnam War. And he felt it was both his rite of passage as a man, but he also understood it to be his duty as a U.S. citizen. He returns to a country after his tour of duty that is completely steeped in anti-war protest and to organizations that are still largely discriminatory against Mexicans. And in 1971, when my parents have me, they make a decision. They decided that they were not going to teach me Spanish. They did this really because of the humiliation and discrimination they faced in schools. They suffered and did not want me to suffer. By the time I'm in high school, Brown versus the Board of Education is already 30 years old, but still I happen to go to a high school that's almost entirely African American and Black students from poor and working class families. And even within that schooling system, there were stratifications, segregation based on language and language acquisition. If you spoke standard academic English, you might find yourself at the top of that stratification. If you were an average student of language arts, you found yourself somewhere in the middle. But if you were a speaker of Spanish as your first language, or you were limited in your English proficiency, you were almost entirely segregated from the rest of the school population. I was lucky enough to find myself at the top of that stratification. I was an honors student. I was a student who was easy to teach. For whatever background knowledge me and my peers had, we were regarded as intelligent. And this intelligence then entitled you to more challenge, higher expectations, and more help from your teachers because they believed strongly that we might actually have a chance to get into college. And it continued a kind of inequity in schools, those of us who were able to get a more quality education than others. And this is not to fault my teachers. They were amazing. They shined on us. They nodded to us. You are special. You are different. The fault really was what a system that determined upon whom they would shine and for what purpose. I was accepted to Georgetown University and graduated here in Washington, D.C., and that's when my entire world turned upside down. First of all, I was no longer an honors student. I was a struggling student. It was hard for me to keep up with the volume of reading that we had. My professors said I had inferior writing skills. This from a kid who made all A's in high school. And I really struggled every single day, especially because when you're the first person in your family to go to college, you're not just failing yourself, you're failing everyone in your family who couldn't go. Your uncles, your aunts, your parents, and your grandparents who were only schooled into grammar school. But the second rude awakening was the status of language in this new environment. I was surrounded by international students, students who their entire lives had spoken a language other than English, and they seemed emboldened by that ability. They were considered talented for it. Even US students had gone to schools of immersion to learn French and Spanish. And this, while people in my own community, poor and brown children, were either stripped of their heritage language or demoted socially and academically for speaking it. And this kind of lit a fire under me. I really had to ask why. Like, why were we ever separated in the first place? And what could I do about it? I think I became an educator largely in part due to this experience. And in my experience, I decided that I was going to be a public school teacher. And in those first years, I was really haunted by several questions. And those were, why don't we not only think that all students can learn at high levels, but that they can do that at more complex levels, right? If they're together rather than separated. And secondly, why can't we use the rich culture and heritage of students and build upon it for higher, results? When I had my own child, I also decided that I was going to teach him in English and in Spanish. I am now the founding principal of Mundo Verde Bilingual Public Charter School, and we are a community of over 500 students. We're considered one of the most diverse schools in Washington, D.C., and students are engaged in learning in fun but demanding ways. They do lots of research and inquiry, they investigate essential questions, and they consult with experts in the field in order to learn as much as they can. And they express their learning in beautiful ways outside of the school to the larger community. And they do this in English and in Spanish. It's really been years in the making as an educator, but when I think about my grandmother, it's been over a century in the making. I had possibly what was one of the longest conversations I ever had with my grandmother right before she passed, this because I had finally mastered Spanish. And in that conversation, she told me about the Mexican schools, and she told me about her heritage and our heritage. And really, it was the first time I understood, right, the struggle that she had been through. I really hope that she and my mother and father and all our ancestors shine down on this work at Mundo Verde, really helping us to create learning environments that build strong ties between students, that build upon the empathy that's part of our core curriculum at Mundo Verde, that really gives students the opportunity to shine and creates less divide in schools and more unity. Thank you.
So Dahlia's talk and story resonates with me so much because I had such a different experience than she did growing up. And languages in my upbringing were Spanish and English. My primary language is Spanish. And they were always valued equally in terms of output, in terms of practice. But my parents always saw the importance of me learning how to speak Spanish and valuing Spanish as an equal partner to English. And so I grew up what we call ambilingual. Now, what I don't possess is any heritage languages or indigenous languages from my country. Those were eradicated from my lineage many generations ago. So this is not something that I possess, although I am part indigenous. I do not speak any of those languages. And it makes me wonder about that. It makes me wonder about the stripping of that identity and the systems, like Dahlia was saying, the systems that are built in order to prioritize some languages as important, right? Because when I look also at my upbringing and why my parents chose to put me in a bilingual school so I could learn English, it was to give me more opportunity. So English was given, the English language was given, it was the language of opportunity. It is the language of opportunity. And so it was given this importance. Again, I'm so grateful that I got to learn Spanish and English at the same time. But the importance of learning English in an environment where English is not spoken as the official or primary language of a country, it was an interesting decision that I didn't think or process until my adulthood. Why would my parents want me to learn to speak English? Let me share my screen again. I apologize. I don't know why that. So how does Dahlia's story relate to our bilingual or multilingual learner context? So take a moment right now to kind of think about your learning spaces, your classrooms, your schools, the reason why you are here, the reason why you have attended this session as well. how does her story relate to your context and to the bilingual or multilingual environment you might be surrounded by? For me, it's I'm an international school teacher. I work with international schools. And one of the things that resonates with me about Dahlia's story is listening to stories of those who have graduated or those who have left, those alumni that are learning to articulate what it felt like for them to be in spaces where their languages felt like where there was language oppression, even if it wasn't intentional. Because in bilingual and multilingual environments that center one dominant language oppression thrives. And even when we have the best of intentions. So on the right-hand side, you'll see an Instagram post by an alumni group from international schools called Decolonize International. And they go to say, we were forced to only speak English on campus so that English only speaking students don't feel excluded. For example, when Korean students speak Korean to each other, and so that we can learn English faster. We were penalized when we spoke our own language on campus, and I still don't know how to articulate why this seems wrong. So in the efforts of saying this is our, the dominant language in our school, we're an English medium school, to be inclusive, we must all speak this language. The language of inclusion is inclusion. The language of inclusion is not one set language. And so it made our students it has made our students who speak other languages kind of say, okay, so in order for me to be inclusive, I need to access this language. Otherwise, I'm not being inclusive. So my language is not for inclusion. My language is for not here, not at school. I leave that boxed up, I leave that outside. And that is part of our students' identity. There's also the myth of the more English, more English will help you learn English faster. That is not true of any language, actually. The exposure is not based on quantity, but rather quality and experience and connections to culture. This has been proven by linguists. We can see it happening with our students. And so even when we have the best of intentions, we would like our students to be successful in learning their academic language. We want our students to have the chance to practice that language. We want everybody to feel included. We forget that hidden under those messages, we forget what our students who are multilingual learners bring as part of their identity within those languages that they speak as their primary or home languages. In the description of this post reads, a lot of international school folks have come to us about the penalization and consequent stigmatization of mother tongues on campus. This has the effect of putting the community in English-speaking bubbles. So thinking about that as well, and Dahlia's story too, where her parents were afraid of her learning Spanish because they had felt how oppressive it was for Spanish speakers in her context. So she wasn't taught Spanish, and she actually, until she became fluent in Spanish, she wasn't able to really communicate with her grandmother. And if she hadn't been able to communicate with her before her passing, she would have never heard the stories of the linguistic inequities that had happened to her grandmother. And probably it's what made Dahlia build the school and reimagine what it could look like to center linguistic equity in educational institutions. Alumni have told us about forgetting their native languages because they were conditioned to speak English exclusively. And when that dominant language, usually it's English in the schools in which we teach, but there can be other languages that are centered that we force, even in our world languages classes or in language classes like Spanish or French. Sometimes we invite our students to come in and the intention is, this is your Spanish speaking time, this is your Spanish usage time. But today I am inviting you to think, what might it look like for you to treat languages equally within a language class for language development, and what that might look like for your students, and how that might help them thrive and grow in an authentic way as their whole selves with their whole linguistic identity. So we're going to move into our first reflection exercise. This is called Think, Chat, Share. And there are 2 guiding questions. Now that you've heard Dahlia's story, you've also heard the unpacking of what linguistic or language equity and inequity means or can mean in our contexts. I want you to think of these 2 questions. How can our teaching methods and curriculum undo a monolingual, sometimes English-only focus? And why should we promote language equity in our learning spaces? And why does it matter? So right now, you can use the chat box to share your thoughts about these questions. You may also take time to just reflect on your own. If you are watching this right now, journaling and taking notes, you can take your time to do that. If you're watching this session with a partner or with a team, you can talk about these questions and there's no need to share on the chat. But I'm going to open the space for a couple of minutes for us to share our thoughts and our reflections on the chat. So we're going to open 2 minutes on the clock for people to share. Oh, I love hearing about native language programs. Thank you for sharing that, Barbara. Deborah, you're absolutely right. Thank you for sharing that. This topic is so important to the well-being of our students. Really, equity practices of any kind, providing equity of access to our students, especially our multilingual students within dominant or monolingual spaces. It ties to child safeguarding. We're making sure that they feel safe and they feel that they belong in our spaces. Thank you so much for sharing that. Mary, I agree. Question 2 can be a whole new seminar. It can be a whole university course. All languages matter equally. Yes. Bea, so nice to see you here from Berlin. Absolutely. I love your reflection on the intentionality of placing students with primary or same language repertoire partners. And yes, Zainab, I agree. The window analogy, I think it's been used with text about books being windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, but so are languages. When you think about it, languages are really it's the first thing that we connect with the people in our family who raise us. It's the first thing that is celebrated when we start using it. All right, continue to share on the chat. I'm going to move on because I want to really talk about language equity and why we're here. Now that we know what it looks like to kind of sometimes treat languages inequitably without even noticing it. Now I'm going to talk to you about the intentionality of creating those, refining our practices to create those equitable spaces with intentionality. Because really, everybody who is here, who's sharing their reflections, who wants to know about linguistic equity, you are a warrior, you are a fighter, you are battling against language oppression, linguistic supremacy, language segregation, and linguistic discrimination. And each of these unpacked in different ways, they mean different things. But language equity is the idea of us battling all of these in our learning spaces. So how can we promote language equity in our learning spaces? What does that intentionality look like? And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about translanguaging. And if perhaps you've heard of translanguaging before, it is a cognitive process, which I'm going to kind of give you an overview. I sit on the shoulders of giants when it comes to the research on translanguaging. I did not come up with it, but I know that I breathe it and I live it every day in my practice, and I try to advocate for translanguaging practices to continuously happen in the spaces around me, because translanguaging is a cognitive process that bilingual and multilingual people do in their brains as they make sense of the world. They translanguage, they use all of their pieces of language to make sense of everything around them, around us. It is impossible to police translanguaging. It happens. Our students, our communities, our BML communities will do it. So how can we leverage this cognitive process? How can we center translanguaging as the intentionality for linguistic equity in our learning spaces? This is one of my favorite books. It sits on my desk every day. I look at it, I think several times in a week to refer to it. And it really takes a deep dive. The image is linked to how you can get the book on Kindle. It's available on Kindle, also on Amazon. And it really is kind of like the study of translanguaging. It shows examples of what teachers all over the world are doing with translanguaging, the translanguaging move, the translanguaging flow, and how we take those practices and make them a reality in our classroom. But because we can't read a book in a 1 hour session, I want to invite Dr. Medina to kind of explain translanguaging in his own phenomenal way, so that you can kind of grasp the idea of what translanguaging is, what that cognitive process looks like, and how it promotes linguistic and language equity in our community.
I've been getting a lot of questions about translanguaging research, and I think the reason that I love this kind of research and translanguaging specifically is because it gives the ownership back to the speaker, back to the individual. And so inside my one language repertoire, which all of us have one linguistic repertoire, I have some academic English, some academic Spanish, some social English, some social Spanish, a little bit of French, I have Spanglish, and all of it is equally valuable. There's no hierarchy. And the key is that we have to be able to move the parts within our bubble based on the context, based on the need for communication. And so right now I'm mobilizing English, pero si quiero hablar en español, puedo movilizar el español. If I'm speaking with my husband, we actually speak en los dos because él es boricua and I'm Mexican American, así es que comunicamos en both, ¿verdad? And if I'm speaking with my parents, then I'm going to use social Spanish, el idioma de mi corazón, and I'm going to say, no, ma, no, pa, pues ya saben, ay, no manchen, ¿de veras? ¿Y qué pasó? And that's equally beautiful.
Dr. Medina is very active on social media. He has a TikTok account, Twitter, LinkedIn, and he has his Monday Medina message as well that I watch religiously every Monday. And he is a doctor in linguistics as well. And Dr. Medina, maybe somebody in this session, maybe you've worked, I know he consults around the United States quite a bit. So maybe you've met Dr. Medina. That is he's in my vision board. I definitely would like to meet him one of these days. He's one of my heroes because he lives his practice of linguistics and linguistic equity through his story and through his own journey of identity and belonging. And really, when we talk about language equity, that is what we're talking about. We're talking about valuing people with their whole selves, their whole identity. And he is such a great example of what it's like to teach our students, teach our communities, teach our BMLs to love their whole selves. We want our students to want to use the languages that they speak with their families, their friends, that we want our students to want to learn other languages because their friends are learning it. We want our students to be successful in academics, and we want our students to experience school, to really become global citizens, empathetic global citizens. And as part of our linguistic repertoire, which is when you take a moment to think about what your linguistic repertoire is, you might think, well, I can only really speak English. But then when you really think about your linguistic repertoire, you think about everything around you, what encompasses your linguistic identity, you will realize that it is so much more complex than that. For me, my primary language is Spanish, and that is the language that I speak to with my family, with my, I know that I code switch from when I talk to my sisters, and I code switch to when I talk to my grandmother. It's not the same Spanish that I use, when even that has different layers. My other language, my other dominant language is English. And I use that for work. I live in an English speaking community, but I live in Vietnam. So I'm also surrounded by Vietnamese. I see it everywhere I go. I listen to it. I can say a few phrases. I am not fluent in Vietnamese, but absolutely it's part of my linguistic repertoire. And I know that we have some people from Guatemala here, and I think those of you that are Chapines, or if you are based in Guatemala, you will know that Guatemalan Spanish is different than Salvadorian Spanish, and it is different than Colombian Spanish, and it is different than Mexican Spanish. And all of those things are part of our linguistic identity as well. And the way that we mobilize those to make sense of the world around us, to want to build on that empathy for others too. Because when we tell our students and when we tell our BMLs in our communities that they have to silo themselves to only use one dominant language because we think that's what's best for them, the layers and the complexities of that linguistic identity are kind of left out, and we are giving the message that they are not important, that they are not equally valuable. And as we know now from alumni in like Dahlia's story, growing up later on, they look back and they are unsure about why that feels so wrong and uncomfortable, when in fact they were living in an oppressive, inequitable system of language. So as we go on today and we continue to talk about how to bring in translanguaging into your learning spaces, think broader as well. How are your day-to-day interactions with people who are bilingual, multilingual? Maybe they don't mobilize your primary language as well as, or as fluently or as proficiently as you might be used to with other people. And how might you make those bridges with those BMLs to be able to value their linguistic identity equally as well, and promote that belonging within your community. Language is this, when I think of language equity, these are the words that come to my, like, this is literally a brainstorm that somebody asked me to do once, and they said, Ceci, think of language equity. What comes to mind? And this is what came to mind. It wasn't like grammar or syntax or, correct vocabulary. It was this. This is what came to mind for me when I thought about not just language equity, but my own linguistic journey, my own linguistic identity, and what makes me me. Languages play such a huge part in that. One of the books that I love, that I came across and that I cannot speak enough about, is Dr. Dano Tanu's book, Growing Up in Transit. And again, this resonates with me because I work at an international school, and Dr. Tanu did a study. Well, she herself was a TCK who graduated from an international school and then went back to international schools to do research on the experience and the story of international school students within international schools. And what she found was that something that we call the hidden curriculum. That's something that she calls the hidden curriculum. And that is like the idea of what are our students learning, not necessarily because we're teaching it, but because of the systems and our behaviors that we have built around them. So one of the most powerful quotes in the book is about teaching the language of the host country, for instance, or in Dahlia's case, erasing Spanish, because knowing Spanish is probably not going to be good. People are not going to be nice to you if you know Spanish. I would rather your primary language be English. And then having that disconnect between her grandmother and her story and her heritage. And so when we talk about linguistic inequity, when Dr. Tano brings it up in her book, she talks about teaching the language of the host country. It has negative attitudes depending on what that language is. I worked for 5 years in Italy, and I know that learning Italian had a very different weight that when I worked in other countries where the host country language wasn't seen as important as Italian. And it made me wonder about that hierarchy of language, right? Like which languages hold the most value and why? Why did my parents want me to learn English? They obviously knew. They obviously knew what they were doing, because I hold the privilege in my positionality in this world as a Guatemalan. I hold this privilege because I am able to mobilize two languages, two dominant languages in the world. And I couldn't be more grateful for that opportunity. But I wonder, could I just have been enough just with Spanish? Could I have had the same opportunities? And so I really appreciate that my parents did that and valued languages equally in my life. And this is what I strive to send that message to families and communities and schools about the importance of our BMLs being able to not only know their primary language, but connect to it in deep levels, if not for anything, but to be able to have conversations with their grandparents, with their families, so that they might also inherit those stories and inherit those experiences as well. Okay, we're going to take a few minutes again to just kind of exhale. And another thing, chat share. So we have two questions for us to reflect on now. The first one is, what are the narratives, terms, and beliefs I hold? So what do you hold about bilingual and multilingual learners in your learning spaces? And how might I create a translanguaging space where bilingual and multilingual learners can access their entire linguistic repertoire to make sense of their learning? So these questions are a little bit deeper, so I'm going to extend this share time to distinct chat share time to 4 minutes. So please do take a moment to think about the questions. Like I said, you can journal individually, you can think on your own. If you are with somebody right now, you can chat with them and kind of process and go through these questions with them, or you can share on the chat. And yes, happy International Mother Language Day to everybody. And also recognizing that family structures look different. Not everybody might have a mother in their family. So I will say happy International Primary Language Day for anyone who not only values their primary languages that they use to connect with their families and their loved ones, but I hope you get to celebrate that today. Wow, I'm seeing some amazing possible collaborations on this chat already. Great. Inez, thank you so much. That's right. I love that language equity offers students the opportunity. You had me at opportunity. That is exactly what it does. It gives students the opportunity, ... fill in the blank. And that's what this is all about. It's equitable access to opportunities. And Rhonda, the book is called Growing Up in Transit by Dr. Dana Otano, and it is linked to the slide deck. So you're able to go to that slide and click on the link, and it'll take you to Dr. Otano's website and how to acquire the book. It's available on as an ebook and also as a paper copy. Hillary, I love that idea of not just being valued, but also giving our BMLs a platform where they can share, not just safely, but also in an empowering way that makes them feel seen and equal partners to their peers who might speak other primary languages. Thank you for that. Leanne, I love that. Show curiosity about students' home languages. Ask what languages they speak to their parents, grandparents, pets, best friends, and what languages do they watch TV or look at their social media, and in what languages are they interacting in those spaces? That's such a phenomenal idea. Love it. Hi, Mary. And yes, being intentional, allowing students the opportunities to share ideas in their primary language. Absolutely. You know, it's not enough to say everybody's allowed to speak their primary language. It's fine. But intentionality is giving them that opportunity. And equitable access opportunity, you're going to hear me say that over and over again, because this is what it's about. And this is what translanguaging practices are about. This is what linguistic equity is about. All right, we're going to move ahead to ensure that we have enough time to go through all of our content today. So let me build your toolkit a little bit right now, giving you some ideas perhaps that you can take away with you and start using tomorrow in your learning spaces, or maybe in your class later today. So promoting language equity within your learning spaces. Here are some tips. Amplify BIPOC voices or multilingual voices, BML voices within your spaces, Encourage multilingual learners to embrace their full identity. Have conversations with them about what their linguistic identity looks like, sounds like. How do they interact with languages every day? Center that conversation in your learning spaces. And of course, create translanguaging opportunities for that cognitive process to not just exist in our students' brains, or for them to think that it's wrong that they're doing it, that they're translanguaging while they are making sense of content or making sense of the world around them or of their learning, but instead invite students to take you through that cognitive process. Sometimes we don't know a good writer is a good writer because we're only asking them to show us writing in a language that they are still learning to be proficient in. But then if we open that opportunity for them to show us how they are a good writer, period. Show me how you are a good writer. They will probably use their primary language and write a full story, or show you how they can use their primary language and leverage some of that bilingualism pieces of the language that they're learning to put a whole writing piece together. And then that's a writer. That's a good writer. And then that's where you can start. And of course, value academic and social language equitably. These two are not two separate things. We interact with the world together. Our colleagues are our friends too. And what we learn and what we teach at school is also our passion, and it's our story and it's our life. So it's the same experience for our BMLs, for our students, for our learners. They experience the world as a whole, and us asking them to silo that is too complex developmentally, and it takes away from who they truly are and who they truly can be. On the right hand side, I actually added this. This is a pretty new resource that I added. It's an article by the amazing Alisa Perreras and Matt Hajun, who are, I think at some point they were both based in Colombia. I think Alisa now is based in Mexico and Matt is based in Colombia. And it talks about language policy. So beyond our learning spaces, really do take a look at this article if you're thinking about the systems that support shifting paradigms and changing monolingual settings into multilingual ones. And this article is one of the best pieces of writing I've ever encountered. And it almost kind of has questions that will lead you into an action plan for your school, so that you can, so that your language policy becomes a conversation about DEIJ, belonging and identity, and then you center multilingualism in your schools and learning spaces. So please do check that out, and it's linked to right here. It's linked to the presentation. So here are some ways that I have promoted linguistic equity in the spaces that I've taught. Please know that the students here and on the right-hand side have already graduated, they're already in university, and I have consent to use these videos. On the left-hand side, I am covering the students' faces for their privacy. But I want to show you how I did these translanguaging moves with my co-teacher, Jamie Bachigalupa. We taught an English class. So the first video that you'll see is two writing partners who are having a writing discussion about a piece that they're going to write, an essay that they had to write, but their writing conference, their writing planning conference is in a primary language that they both manage and can use. On the left-hand side, we have two readers who we were wondering if they knew reading partner strategies, if they could sit next to each other and go through these, looking at details and going back and forth in the story. And they hadn't been able to do it until they brought a book from home that it was in their primary language. And then they were able to show us that they could do these reading skills. So that was really cool. And then on the right-hand side, we have some bilingual parallel reading. So we had two students whose primary language was French, and we were in an English medium school, and they were in 9th grade, but they were emergent bilinguals. So they were reading George Orwell's 1984. Oh, sorry, no, Animal Farm. And they had the copy in French and the copy in English. So they were doing parallel reading the book at the same time, going back and forth. And what it was so beautiful about that too is that it opens up for an inquiry-based approach to language. because they started kind of questioning the translation in the books and saying, I think this translation is not right, because what the writer meant to say, what the author meant to say in English here is this, and the word that we use in French is this one, not this one. This is like Google Translate kind of translation. And it just opened up this whole like discussion about like whether the translation was correct or not, and whether it was conveying the same message in either one of those languages. So please do bring ideas and approaches like this, where you allow students to pair up with students with the same language repertoire. You give opportunities to students to show you their skills by bringing a tool in their primary language instead of attempting that for them to show you what they can do in a language that they're not proficient in yet. And then, of course, bringing in like being intentional about what you, the text that you have in your learning spaces, the resources that you have that will allow for access to high level content in your classrooms and in your schools. And for those of you who use social media, honestly, there's so much out there. I'm all for deprivatizing practice. And all you have to do really is look for hashtags on Twitter. If you're not a Twitter user, Instagram as well. LinkedIn is a perfect place to go out there and look for ideas, because when you look for hashtags like translanguaging, language equity, multilingualism, you will see a plethora of fabulous ideas about ways that teachers all over the world are making translanguaging moves in their classrooms, and how they are creating those opportunities for multilingual learners to access content and have authentic conversations of their whole linguistic selves within their classrooms as well. So please do explore and continue to see what other teachers and educators are doing in other schools. And with that, this is the link to the Padlet that I had mentioned at the beginning. The Padlet will have a reflection of 3 points to remember, 2 things you liked, and 1 question that you might have. And with those questions that you might have, I will definitely tackle them later on that Padlet. So in the next few days, I will be visiting that Padlet, and I will be going back. If you have any questions, any burning questions, I am happy to answer them directly on there. And then anybody who visits the Padlet, which is a collaborative space, can see my responses and can continue the conversation. So thank you so much, NEASC community. I am just so honored to be here and to have shared with you about language equity. And so thank you so much for your presence and attention.
Thank you so much, Ceci, for being here with all of us, especially late at night for you. On behalf of everyone at NEASC and in our global learning community, we just would wish to thank you. And thanks to everyone who has shared their deep thoughts on the chat today. We'd like to thank you for being here, and please join us again soon. Thank you, Ceci. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Gracias a todos. Bye-bye.
Adios.